crime. I mean, and that's, but you're right. Aside from guys who really could be leaders in bad, you create more people by keeping them here as so I agree. But they're not, but a lot of them are innocent. But go on, Mo, Andy.
Well, there's been a lot of exaggeration and hysteria about this that has been stoked repeatedly throughout the media, throughout the establishment. I think there is evidence that the number of people who have been released from Guantanamo who have engaged in anything that could be described as terrorism is very small, that it's much, much smaller than the figures that are regularly bandied about. The latest, the media tends to put together both the people that the establishment says are confirmed and suspected of re-engagement or engagement. That you shouldn't put the two together. The suspected ones are, let's put those aside. Don't start saying those are official figures. You've got a 16% figure. I think Peter and the research that's done here has said it's more like 6. And we just don't have this backed up properly. If it was investigated properly, we'd find that
well, let me ask a question, because this is relevant. So, because most of the people who re-engaged, or whatever the term you want to use, or the Bush administration released a lot more people than the Obama administration. Yeah. Many of them were Saudis, and in fact, the 2 leaders of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula are Saudi, and they're both Guantanamo releasees. So the question is, now that there was this Matt Olson led the process where they looked at all the cases and the releases that have been happening now. Do we have any sense? I mean, my intuition is that of those, almost nobody has gone over.
Cliff Sloan said of those,
yeah,
the percentage, and it's a fairly broad definition, re-engaging, non-fighting, is 6.5%.
Okay, well.
But
See, most Americans, this is the thing, it's like for most Americans, if it's anything above 0%, even though we know that in our own system, in the federal court system, 66 people reoffend.
Well, there you go. And this is the exaggeration and hysteria, frankly, because if you've got a 60 to 70% recidivism rate within the domestic prison system, and people want it to be 0 in Guantanamo, forgetting, all of the different angles of, whether people engage or re-engage, how some people are frankly going to be very upset about the things that have happened to them. But the fact is, the illusion that is created is that if you release, a single recidivist from Guantanamo, what it means is a guy who's going to be getting into a jumbo jet and trying to fly it into a tall building. These are not people who are being recommended for release. On every layer, there's hysteria and exaggeration, because the genuinely dangerous people, the handful of people accused of being genuinely dangerous, are not going to be released under any circumstances like this. So you're talking about people who were essentially, at best, low-level foot soldiers serving with the Taliban against the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. And we come back to the whole problem with the war on terror, which is that the Bush administration said to the American people, these are the worst of the worst, trust us, they're all terrorists. When a Kuwaiti guy that Tom talked about, called Fawzi al-Oda, was released from Guantanamo in the fall, he had his periodic review board recommend him for release. The BBC News website ran, the headline for the story was, terror suspect released to Kuwait. I have a friend who works for the BBC website. I got in touch with him, and I said, look, he was accused of training on a rifle in a camp in Pakistan one afternoon. He has never actually been accused of terrorism at all. And my friend went, you're absolutely right, Andy, I'll change it. But that's the casual nature of what happened after 9/11 with the war on terror, is that foot soldiers in Afghanistan were turned into terrorists by the Bush administration. And it's a huge part of the problem that has existed ever since. We are unable to differentiate between foot soldiers and terrorists and civilians.
Let me ask you a question. So the 5 Taliban leaders who were exchanged for Private Bo Bergdahl, who went to Qatar, do we know what's happened to them? Are they under house arrest in Qatar? Have they done anything?
As I understand it, they have done nothing. They're not under house arrest.
Yeah.
Can I say, of course, as you pointed out, they, in the military had said this, they would probably have needed to be released soon anyway with the end of the war. So we basically gave them back and got Bergdahl.
Yeah.
And my understanding, though, is that they are not accused of having done anything since.
We haven't heard anything about them, so I'm presuming.
My understanding of them, these are the guys who were,
They were cabinet ministers. I mean, they were.
Yeah, well, they're also, they're in their 50s or even perhaps
Yeah.
in their 60s. I think they're
Nothing the matter with
they're
that.
happily retired.
In gutter.
And enjoying swanning around in Qatar and not being back in Afghanistan.
I was on Chris Matthews' show the day that the transfer was announced, and he ripped me a new one for, how could President Obama send these, bloodthirsty, guys back out to, kill more Americans? And I'm like, more Americans?
Right.
Where's the evidence they ever did anything? My job as chief prosecutor, the 779, only saw the cases of the ones where we felt that there was a determination there was potentially evidence that would warrant prosecution. So the 779, there were roughly 75 that we'd identified as potential cases for prosecution, so less than 10%. When I saw the five, when the announcement came out, these 5 people were being traded, and I looked at the list and I said, who in the hell are these guys? I mean, they didn't even have enough evidence to even make it to my desk to be considered for prosecution, yet they're labeled as being these bloodthirsty terrorists that are going to go back and kill more Americans when they never...
Well, it's a very, very valid point, Mo, actually, that, I mean, a couple of those guys were accused of atrocities in Afghanistan, which had never been confirmed as such, but it was part of the inter-Afghanistan, civil war.
But the point,
They are, none of them were ever accused of
but it's really the
anything
point
from
this
America.
gentleman made. Unless you get a very bad guy.
Okay, so we're going to.
Assume that they go back, so what?
No, that's your point, except for a guy like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. That is your point.
Ann Speckard from Georgetown University. I worked on the detainee rehabilitation program where we had 20,000 detainees, 800 juveniles. And just as you said, so many were picked up that, just in a sweep, probably completely innocent, held for a very long time. I was able to make interviews of them, also Palestinians, Kashmiris, that were held under so-called open check, without a clear accusation and clear court process. And I would just like to confirm a lot of what you're saying. I mean, this in itself is psychological torture, to be held in a prison cell having no idea what your future is.
Right,
So,
right,
Adeline, just to explain. So you went to Guantanamo. I didn't quite get
I
what
didn't
you
work in Guantanamo. I worked in 2006 putting together the detainee rehabilitation program in Iraq for
Okay.
our 20,000 detainees, 800 juveniles. So it was an Islamic challenge and psychological program. And a lot of our detainees, in Iraq at least, were beaten badly when they were arrested. Some of them had so-called soft torture in the prison, the high-value ones. Less were tortured except for Abu Ghraib. And but what I found in talking with these people is, okay, that was awful, but the ones that had been in Iraqi hands were very happy to come into our hands because we don't torture the same. But being put in a prison cell and having no idea of your future is torture in itself. And that's something that we don't think about. Anybody should go lock themselves in the closet for 20 minutes, see how they feel about it. And imagine, 13 years?
Can I mention that, and I normally make that point, that we concentrate on physical torture. It's a much worse torture
It's
to be kept someplace without cause and without having a hearing forever. There was one of our guys, not Fauzi al-Oda, but Fayez al-Khandari is still there, who said to me, I said, did they torture you? He described these things, and he said to me, that's over. I can take that. What I can't take is sitting here without reason forever without a chance to get out.
And I can confirm for you that I've talked to people that have gotten out, Palestinians, for example, and they told me they have PTSD. I'm a psychologist, I can diagnose it. They have PTSD, they're having flashbacks. They're so afraid, could I get picked up again? Could this happen to me again? I mean, it's gonna be with them for their entire lives of being put in a small cell. And also people told me